In a bustling city park, a racist police officer mistakenly arrests a black man, only to discover later that he is actually an FBI agent. Marcus Johnson sat on a worn bench in Central Park, the late afternoon sun casting a warm glow over the vibrant greenery. He turned a page in the novel he was engrossed in, temporarily losing himself in the soft rustle of leaves and the distant laughter of children playing nearby. The park was one of his favorite spots, a small haven amidst the city's chaos, allowing him to clear his mind and escape the stresses of his job. However, today, his peace was disrupted. Across the park, Officer Jake Matthews patrolled the area, his keen eyes scanning the surroundings. He had walked this beat for nearly 20 years, convinced that he knew the city better than anyone. When he noticed Marcus sitting alone on the bench, something stirred in his gut, a feeling he had learned to trust over the years. A black man sitting alone, too composed, too calm. "Never seen him around here before," Jake muttered to himself. He halted his stride and observed Marcus for a moment, trying to pinpoint the discomfort gnawing at him. There had been vague reports of a suspect fitting a general description that matched Marcus. Thin evidence, but enough to pique Jake's suspicion. Feeling the weight of someone's gaze, Marcus looked up from his book and caught sight of Jake standing a distance away, staring at him with an expression that was all too familiar. Marcus had encountered situations like this before. He could easily read the officer's expression, prejudice disguised as concern. This suspicion had no basis other than the color of his skin. But Marcus didn't flinch. Instead, he slowly closed his book, marking the page with a finger, and met Jake's gaze. Jake's grip on his baton tightened at the calmness that radiated from Marcus. "Let's see what this guy's up to," he muttered as he approached, his posture rigid with each step. He didn't like how Marcus was looking at him, steady, unafraid. It unnerved him. Marcus observed Jake coming closer, keeping his expression neutral. He knew what was about to unfold and had seen it many times before. The air was already thick with tension, and he was keenly aware that how he responded in the next moments could determine the outcome. He wasn't in the mood for confrontation, but he wouldn't give the officer any reason to escalate the situation. "Good afternoon," Jake said as he reached the bench. His tone was polite, but an edge lingered beneath it. "Good afternoon," Marcus replied, his voice calm and even, his hands visible, resting on the book in his lap. "What brings you out here today?" Jake asked, his eyes scanning Marcus's face, then flicking to the book. He was fishing for something, anything to justify his growing suspicion. "Just enjoying the park," Marcus said. "It's a nice day." Jake nodded slowly, though he wasn't truly listening. He was more focused on what Marcus wasn't saying. "You from around here?" Marcus smiled slightly, though it didn't reach his eyes. "I've been around." The vague response didn't sit well with Jake. He shifted his weight, his stance becoming more confrontational. "Mind if I see some ID?" Marcus's smile faded. This was the pivotal moment where things could spiral. He knew his rights and that he wasn't obligated to show ID just for sitting in a public park. But refusing could quickly escalate the situation. Still, he wouldn't allow this officer to intimidate him. "Am I under arrest?" Marcus asked, his tone measured, meeting Jake's gaze without flinching. Jake bristled at the question. There was that calmness again, that refusal to be intimidated. It made him uneasy. "You will be if you don't cooperate," he shot back, his hand hovering near his holster. Marcus took a slow breath, maintaining his neutral expression. He disliked where this was headed, but he wouldn't back down. "I'm just sitting in a park," he said steadily. "Is there a law against that?" Jake's patience was wearing thin. "You fit the description of someone we're looking for," he said, though even he knew how weak that excuse sounded. He stepped closer, looming over Marcus. Marcus remained unmoved, holding Jake's gaze, refusing to provide the reaction he craved. "And what description is that?" Marcus asked quietly. Jake's jaw tightened. He didn't have a solid answer and knew it, but admitting that would mean losing face. "Don't get smart with me," he snapped. "Show me some ID." For a moment, the two men locked eyes, the tension thickening. Marcus knew he could push back and assert his rights, but he also understood the potential danger of doing so. He decided to comply for now. Without a word, he reached into his pocket slowly, deliberately, and pulled out his wallet. Jake watched closely, his body coiled like a spring. When Marcus handed over his ID, Jake snatched it from his hand, glancing at it. The name didn't mean anything to him, but that didn't matter. He had already made up his mind. "Stand up," Jake ordered, stepping back to give Marcus room. Marcus sighed inwardly but complied, rising slowly from the bench, keeping his hands visible, not wanting to give Jake any reason to claim he felt threatened. "Turn around," Jake commanded, pulling out a pair of handcuffs. Marcus felt a surge of frustration, but pushed it down, turning around and letting Jake cuff him without resistance. He could hear people nearby, feel their eyes on him, but he remained calm, knowing the worst thing he could do was give in to anger. As Jake tightened the cuffs around Marcus's wrists, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, that he was making a mistake. But his pride wouldn't allow him to stop now. He grabbed Marcus's arm and started leading him toward the patrol car parked nearby. Marcus remained silent as they walked, his mind already shifting to what would come next. He wasn't worried about himself. He knew who he was and that this officer would discover the truth soon enough. But he felt a profound weariness, an exhaustion that went beyond this one encounter. It was the fatigue of knowing that despite his accomplishments, he was still seen as just another black man in the eyes of too many people, like Officer Jake Matthews. As they reached the patrol car, Jake opened the back door and guided Marcus inside. The tension hung heavily in the air. Marcus settled into the seat, the cold metal of the handcuffs biting into his wrists. He looked out the window as the car pulled away from the park, watching the trees blur past and wondering how this day, like so many others, had gone so wrong. The patrol car's engine hummed as Officer Jake Matthews drove Marcus Johnson toward the precinct. Jake's grip on the steering wheel was tight, his knuckles white as he processed what had just happened. He didn't like the way Marcus had looked at him, calm, unafraid, as if he knew something that Jake didn't. The thought gnawed at him, making him question his instincts. Marcus sat quietly in the back seat, his hands cuffed behind him. The city streets blurred by, but his mind was not on the passing scenery. Instead, he was focused on what would happen next. He knew the system well, understood how quickly things could escalate if he wasn't careful, but he also recognized his own authority, an authority that Officer Matthews had no idea about. As they neared the precinct, Jake glanced at Marcus in the rearview mirror. "What were you really doing in that park?" he asked, suspicion lacing his voice. "I told you," Marcus replied calmly. "I was just reading." Jake scoffed. "A guy like you, just sitting around reading? You expect me to believe that?" "A guy like me?" Marcus repeated, his tone measured. Jake hesitated, realizing the slip in his words. But instead of backing down, he doubled down. "You don't look like someone who spends his afternoons reading in the park," he said, trying to justify his actions. Marcus didn't respond immediately. He let the silence stretch, the tension in the car thickening. When he finally spoke, his voice was cool and controlled. "And what does someone like me look like, officer?" Jake didn't answer. He couldn't. He knew what he was implying and how it sounded, but he wasn't about to admit that to Marcus or to himself. Instead, he focused on driving, his frustration mounting as Marcus's calm demeanor continued to unsettle him. The car pulled into the precinct's parking lot, and Jake parked near the entrance. He got out first, then opened the back door, helping Marcus out. The cuffs still dug into Marcus's wrists as they walked toward the building. Jake's thoughts raced. He needed to figure out what to do next. This wasn't how arrests were supposed to go. The suspect was meant to be scared, compliant, not composed and challenging him with every word. Inside the precinct, the usual buzz of activity filled the air. Officers filing reports, phones ringing, the hum of conversation. Jake led Marcus through the main hall, ignoring the curious glances from other officers. He didn't want to explain himself just yet, not until he was sure of his next move. They reached the booking area, and Jake signaled for Marcus to stand by the processing desk. The officer behind the desk, a young man named Officer Carter, looked up, surprised to see Jake bringing someone in. "What's this about?" Carter asked, his eyes flicking to Marcus and back to Jake. "Caught him acting suspicious in the park," Jake replied, his tone clipped. He handed over Marcus's ID, still unwilling to admit that he didn't have a solid reason for the arrest. Carter glanced at the ID, then back at Marcus. There was a flicker of recognition in his eyes, but he quickly masked it, nodding as he began typing into the computer. "Captain Bennett's in her office," Carter said, handing the ID back to Jake. "You'll need to take him to her." Jake stiffened slightly. Captain Laura Bennett was known for being tough, but fair. a stickler for procedure. He hadn't planned on involving her so soon, but he didn't have a choice. "All right," Jake said, his voice tight. He turned to Marcus, his grip firm on Marcus's arm. "Let's go." Marcus walked beside Jake, his expression still unreadable as they approached Captain Bennett's office. He could sense the tension in Jake, the uncertainty that the officer was trying so hard to hide. It was the first crack in the armor, and Marcus noted it with quiet satisfaction. Jake knocked on the door, then opened it when he heard Captain Bennett's voice. The office was neat and organized, with a large desk in the center and shelves lined with books and files. Captain Bennett, a woman in her early 40s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, looked up from her paperwork as they entered. "Officer Matthews?" she said, her tone neutral. "What's this about?" Jake stepped forward, guiding Marcus into the room. "Caught this guy in the park. He was acting suspicious. Wouldn't cooperate when I asked for ID." Captain Bennett's gaze shifted to Marcus, and for a split second, there was a flicker of recognition. Just like Officer Carter. But she quickly masked it, her expression turning professional. "Is that so?" she said evenly. Marcus met her eyes, sensing the recognition there. He knew that Captain Bennett was aware of who he was, but she was playing it carefully, waiting to see how Jake would handle the situation. "That's right," Jake continued, oblivious to the silent exchange. "I brought him in for questioning." Captain Bennett nodded slowly, her eyes narrowing slightly. "I see. And did you have probable cause to arrest him?" Jake hesitated, feeling the ground beneath him start to shift. "He wouldn't cooperate," he repeated, though it sounded weaker this time. Captain Bennett leaned back in her chair, studying Jake carefully. "Officer Matthews, why don't you step outside for a moment? I'd like to speak with Mr. Johnson alone." Jake blinked, taken aback by the request, but Captain Bennett's tone left no room for argument. "Outside, Matthews," she said firmly. Reluctantly, Jake released Marcus and stepped out of the office, closing the door behind him. As soon as he was gone, Captain Bennett's demeanor shifted slightly, becoming less formal. "Mr. Johnson," she said calmly, "I apologize for this misunderstanding." Marcus allowed himself a small smile. "No need to apologize, Captain. You're just doing your job." Bennett sighed, glancing at the closed door. "I'm aware of who you are, but I'd appreciate it if we kept that under wraps for now. I need to handle this situation carefully." Marcus nodded. "Of course. I'm not here to cause trouble, Captain. I just want to make sure things are handled properly." "They will be," Bennett assured him. "I'll speak with Officer Matthews and deal with this appropriately. But I have to ask, why didn't you just tell him who you are?" Marcus's smile faded, replaced by a more serious expression. "Because it shouldn't matter, Captain. My identity shouldn't be the reason he decides to treat me with respect." Captain Bennett considered his words and nodded in understanding. "You're right, it shouldn't matter, but unfortunately, it does to some people." The room fell silent for a moment, the weight of the situation hanging in the air. Finally, Captain Bennett stood up. "I'll call Officer Matthews back in. We'll resolve this." Marcus nodded again, watching as Captain Bennett moved to the door. The confrontation wasn't over, but he knew he had the upper hand now. The truth would come out soon enough, and Officer Matthews would have to face the consequences of his actions. As Captain Bennett opened the door, Jake stepped back inside, his expression wary. He could sense that something had shifted, but didn't know what. He glanced at Marcus, who stood calmly, waiting. "Mr. Johnson is not the man you were looking for," Bennett said firmly. "You'll release him immediately." Jake blinked, the words taking a moment to sink in. "What? But, Captain, immediately, Officer Matthews," Bennett repeated, her voice leaving no room for argument. Jake hesitated, then finally reached for the keys to unlock Marcus's handcuffs. His hand shook slightly as he did so, the realization of his mistake beginning to dawn on him. As the cuffs clicked open, Marcus rubbed his wrists and gave Jake a measured look. "Thank you, officer," he said, his tone calm but carrying an undertone of finality. "You're free to go," Jake muttered, stepping back. Marcus nodded and turned to Captain Bennett. "I'll be in touch, Captain," he said quietly. "There's still a lot to discuss." Captain Bennett nodded in return, understanding the weight behind his words. "I look forward to it, Mr. Johnson." With that, Marcus walked out of the office, leaving Jake standing there with a sinking feeling in his gut. The confrontation was over, but the consequences were only beginning. Officer Jake Matthews sat at his desk in the precinct, the tension in his body refusing to dissipate. He had barely been able to concentrate since Captain Bennett had released Marcus Johnson. The unease gnawed at him, deepened by the fact that he still didn't fully comprehend what had just transpired. He knew he had made a mistake, but the extent of it remained elusive. The silence of the precinct around him was both comforting and unnerving, a space for his thoughts to spiral. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps approaching his desk snapped him out of his reverie. He looked up to see Captain Bennett walking toward him, her expression serious. "Officer Matthews, my office." "Now," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. Jake stood up immediately, trying to suppress the nervousness creeping into his demeanor. He followed her to the office, each step feeling heavier than the last. Once inside, Captain Bennett closed the door behind him and gestured for him to sit. Brian hesitated for a moment before sitting down, feeling the tension in the room, the unspoken weight of what was coming. Captain Bennett moved behind her desk, took a deep breath, and then sat down across from him, her sharp eyes fixed on his. "Officer Matthews," she began, her tone measured but stern. "Do you have any idea who Marcus Johnson is?" Jake shook his head, his confusion deepening. "No, Captain. Just some guy in the park." Captain Bennett leaned forward, her gaze unwavering. "Marcus Johnson isn't just some guy in the park. He's a special agent, one of the top agents, in fact." The words hit Jake like a physical blow. His eyes widened in shock as the implications of what he had done crashed down on him. "An FBI agent?" he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. "That's right," Bennett said, her voice firm. "And his arrest is going to have serious consequences. Not just for you, but for this entire precinct." Jake's mind raced, trying to piece together what this meant. He had profiled and arrested an innocent man, a federal agent, based solely on his own biased assumptions. The enormity of his mistake began to settle in, bringing with it a cold, creeping dread. "I didn't know, Captain," Jake said, his voice shaky. "I didn't know who he was." "That's the problem, Matthews," Bennett replied, her tone still firm. "It shouldn't have mattered who he was. Your actions were based on assumptions and prejudices, not on any real evidence. You can't arrest someone just because they don't look like they belong in a park." Jake wanted to argue, to defend himself, but the words wouldn't come. Deep down, he knew Captain Bennett was right. He had let his biases guide his actions, and now he was facing the consequences. "What happens now?" Jake asked, his voice low, almost resigned. Captain Bennett sighed, leaning back in her chair. "For now, you're being placed on temporary leave while we investigate this incident. I've already spoken with the higher-ups, and they're not happy, to say the least. There will be an official review, and depending on the outcome, you could face disciplinary action, including termination." Jake's heart sank. Termination. The word hung in the air like a death sentence. He had been a cop for over 2 decades, and the thought of losing his badge was almost too much to bear. But as much as he wanted to deny it, he knew he had no one to blame but himself. "I understand, Captain," Jake finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. Bennett studied him for a moment, her expression softening slightly. "I know this isn't easy to hear, Matthews, but you need to understand that your actions have consequences. Not just for you, but for the people you serve. We can't afford to have officers who let their biases dictate their decisions." Jake nodded, though his mind was still reeling. The reality of his situation was starting to sink in, and with it came a flood of regret. He had always prided himself on being a good cop, someone who upheld the law and protected the community. But now, all of that was in jeopardy because of one careless, prejudiced decision. Captain Bennett stood up, signaling that the conversation was over. "You're dismissed, Officer Matthews. I'll notify you when the review is scheduled." Jake stood up as well, feeling the weight of the world on his shoulders. "Thank you, Captain," he mumbled before turning and walking out of the office. As he left the precinct, the familiar sights and sounds that had once brought him comfort now felt distant, almost alien. He walked to his car in a daze, the reality of his situation pressing down on him like a heavy fog. He had been a cop for so long that he didn't know who he was without the badge. The thought of losing it, of being branded a failure, terrified him. But beneath the fear, there was something else, an unfamiliar sense of doubt. For the first time, Jake was forced to confront the fact that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't the upstanding officer he had always believed himself to be, that he had let his biases and prejudices guide his actions more than he was willing to admit. As he drove home, the city streets passing by in a blur, Jake couldn't shake the image of Marcus Johnson's calm, unflinching gaze. It was a look that had unsettled him from the start, and now he understood why. Marcus had seen right through him, had known exactly what was happening even before Jake himself did. When Jake finally arrived home, he sat in his car for a long moment, staring at the steering wheel. The day's events played over and over in his mind, each repetition making the weight of his actions heavier. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew that his life had just changed irrevocably. With a heavy sigh, Jake got out of the car and walked into his house. The silence of the empty rooms pressed in on him as he sank into a chair, his thoughts a tangled mess of fear, regret, and uncertainty. For the first time in a long while, he didn't know what to do next. Officer Jake Matthews stood in the hallway outside the conference room, his heart pounding in his chest. The precinct was quieter than usual, the atmosphere heavy with the anticipation of what was about to unfold. The official review was about to begin, and Jake knew that every word he said in the next hour could determine the future of his career. He glanced at his reflection in the window across from him. The man staring back looked older, more worn than he had just days ago. There was a stiffness in his posture, a tightness around his eyes that hadn't been there before. He straightened his uniform, took a deep breath, and forced himself to focus. This was his chance to explain, to justify his actions. Though deep down, he wasn't sure how to do that anymore. The door to the conference room opened, and Captain Bennett appeared, her expression unreadable. "We're ready for you, Officer Matthews," she said, her voice steady. Jake nodded, swallowing hard as he followed her into the room. Inside, the atmosphere was tense, the long table lined with stern-faced officials, representatives from the precinct's internal affairs division, a couple of high-ranking officers, and at the far end, a man in a suit whom Jake instantly recognized as Marcus Johnson. Marcus's presence was like a punch to the gut. Jake had hoped he wouldn't be there, that he wouldn't have to face him again. But there he was, sitting calmly, his eyes focused on Jake as if studying him. The look in those eyes was the same as before. Calm, unflinching, but with an edge of quiet authority that made Jake feel small. Captain Bennett took her seat at the head of the table, motioning for Jake to sit in the chair opposite him. He did so, trying to ignore the way his palms were sweating. The room was silent, the weight of judgment heavy in the air. "Officer Matthews," Bennett began, her tone formal. "This review is to determine the appropriateness of your actions during the arrest of Mr. Marcus Johnson. We will go over the events leading up to the arrest, your conduct during the arrest, and the consequences that have followed. Do you understand the gravity of this situation?" "Yes, Captain," Jake replied, his voice low but steady. He glanced briefly at Marcus, who was watching him intently, before returning his focus to Bennett. "Good," Bennett said, nodding. "Let's start with the incident report. According to your statement, you arrested Mr. Johnson because you believed he was a suspect in a recent series of robberies. Is that correct?" Jake nodded. "Yes, Captain. I saw him in the park, and he matched the description we had. A tall black male in his early 40s. He was acting suspiciously." "And what exactly was suspicious about his behavior?" Bennett asked, her tone neutral but probing. Jake hesitated, knowing that his answer here was crucial. He was alone, just sitting there, and when I asked for his ID, he was evasive. "Evasive? How?" Bennett pressed. "He didn't want to show me his ID right away," Jake explained, though even as he said the words, they sounded weak to his own ears. "He seemed like he was hiding something." Marcus's voice cut through the air, calm but firm. "I was reading a book, Officer Matthews. Not exactly the behavior of a criminal on the run." Jake flinched slightly at Marcus's words, but kept his focus on Bennett. "I was just doing my job, Captain. I was trying to protect the community." "And did you find anything on Mr. Johnson that would indicate he was involved in any criminal activity?" Bennett asked, her eyes narrowing slightly. Jake shook his head. "No, he was clean." There was a pause, a heavy silence that filled the room as everyone processed what had been said. Then one of the internal affairs officers spoke up, his voice stern. "Officer Matthews, did it ever occur to you that Mr. Johnson might have been telling the truth, that he wasn't the suspect you were looking for?" Jake hesitated again, his mind racing for the right words. "I was following protocol. We're trained to be cautious, to assume that someone might be dangerous until proven otherwise. But did you consider that your assumptions might have been influenced by factors other than protocol? The officer asked pointedly. Jake's throat tightened. He knew what they were getting at, and he knew there was no good answer. I didn't mean to profile him, he said, his voice faltering slightly. I was just doing my job. Marcus leaned forward slightly, his gaze still fixed on Jake. Your job is to protect and serve, Officer Matthews, not to judge people based on their appearance. Jake met Marcus's eyes, and for a moment he felt a surge of defensiveness, but it was quickly followed by a wave of guilt. He had been in law enforcement long enough to know when he was wrong, and this was one of those times. Captain Bennett cleared her throat, drawing the room's attention back to her. Officer Matthews, this review isn't just about what happened that day. It's about the mindset that led to your actions. We need to ensure that every officer in this precinct is upholding the values of fairness and justice. This isn't just about you, it's about the integrity of the entire police force. Jake felt a sinking feeling in his gut. He knew this wasn't just about whether or not he had made a mistake. It was about whether he was fit to continue wearing the badge. The realization hit him hard, and for a moment he struggled to find his voice. I understand, Captain, he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. Bennett studied him for a moment, her expression softening slightly. We all make mistakes, Matthews, but it's how we deal with those mistakes that define us. You need to think very carefully about the kind of officer you want to be. There was another long pause, the weight of the situation pressing down on everyone in the room. Then Marcus spoke again, his voice calm but carrying a weight of authority. Captain Bennett, may I say something? Bennett nodded. Of course, Mr. Johnson. Marcus stood up, his presence commanding the attention of the room. He looked directly at Jake, his expression serious but not unkind. I understand that being a police officer is a difficult job. You are under constant pressure, and sometimes that pressure can lead to bad decisions, but we can't allow those bad decisions to go unchecked. This isn't just about holding Officer Matthews accountable, it's about ensuring that something like this doesn't happen again, Marcus continued. Jake listened, his heart heavy. He knew Marcus was right, but the truth was hard to swallow. He had spent his entire career believing he was doing the right thing, but now he faced the reality that his actions had caused harm, that his biases had blinded him to the truth. Marcus continued, his voice steady. I'm not here to ruin anyone's career, but I am here to ensure that the next time an officer encounters someone like me, they think twice before making assumptions. This is an opportunity for change, and I hope that this precinct will take it seriously. Captain Bennett nodded, her expression thoughtful. Thank you, Mr. Johnson. Your words are noted. Marcus sat down again, his gaze still on Jake. There was no malice in his eyes, just a quiet determination, a resolve to see justice done. Captain Bennett looked at Jake, her tone softer but still authoritative. Officer Matthews, you'll remain on temporary leave while we continue this review. I suggest you take this time to reflect on what's been said here today. We'll reconvene in a few days to discuss the next steps. Jake nodded numbly, the weight of everything pressing down on him. Yes, Captain, he said quietly. The meeting was adjourned, and as the officials began to file out of the room, Jake remained seated, his mind racing. He had come into this review hoping to defend himself, to justify his actions. But now, all he could think about was how wrong he had been. The realization was a cold, hard truth he couldn't escape. As the last of the officials left the room, Jake stood up slowly, his movements heavy with the burden of his thoughts. He glanced at Marcus one last time, and for a moment their eyes met. There was no animosity in Marcus's gaze, just a quiet determination, a resolve to see justice done. Jake looked away, unable to hold Marcus's gaze any longer. He knew he had a lot to think about, a lot to come to terms with. And as he walked out of the conference room, the weight of his actions and their consequences hung over him like a dark cloud. Captain Laura Bennett sat in her office, staring at the stack of reports on her desk. Each piece of paper represented a fragment of the truth she was trying to piece together. The internal investigation into Jake Matthews' conduct was underway, and it was her responsibility to ensure that every detail was thoroughly examined. She rubbed her temples, feeling the tension in her shoulders. The precinct had always prided itself on maintaining high standards, but this incident had shaken that foundation, Whatever the outcome, Bennett knew the investigation would have far-reaching consequences. Not just for Jake, but for the entire department. Taking a deep breath, she reached for the first report, the initial witness statements from the park. She had already read them multiple times, but each reread added weight to the growing evidence against Jake. The witnesses, all park-goers present during the arrest, described the event with stark clarity. Their accounts were consistent. Jake had approached Marcus Johnson with the assumption that he was a criminal, without hesitation and without attempting to de-escalate. Bennett turned to the report containing the body cam footage. She had watched it several times, each viewing more uncomfortable than the last. The footage was clear and unambiguous. Jake's voice, his tone, and his body language reflected the assumptions he had made from the moment he saw Marcus. The aggression in his approach, the way he had disregarded Marcus's attempts to explain, the force he used during the arrest. It was all there, laid bare for anyone to see. A knock at the door pulled Bennett from her thoughts. She looked up to see Detective Harper, her second-in-command for the investigation, standing in the doorway. "I've got the last of the witness interviews," Harper said, holding up a file, "and I've scheduled Marcus Johnson for later this afternoon." "Thanks, Harper," Bennett replied, taking the file. "How's it looking?" Harper sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. "Not good, Captain. Most of the witnesses are pretty clear about what they saw, and from what I can tell, the body cam footage backs them up." Bennett nodded grimly, fearing that outcome. "Are we bringing Jake in for another round of questions?" "Yeah," Bennett said, leaning back in her chair. "Let's see if he's ready to talk more openly about what happened." Harper nodded and left the office, leaving Bennett alone with the file. She flipped it open and began reading the new witness statements. They were consistent with the others. Jake had acted aggressively from the start, and it was clear that Marcus had been trying to defuse the situation. But Jake hadn't listened. As Bennett finished reading, she felt a deep sense of unease. She had known Jake for years. He had always been a solid officer. But this incident had exposed a side of him that Bennett had never seen before. The hours passed slowly as Bennett continued to review the evidence. Finally, there was another knock at her door, and Harper entered, followed by Jake. "Come in, Matthews," Bennett said, keeping her voice neutral. Jake looked exhausted, his eyes dark with sleeplessness. He sat down across from Bennett, glancing nervously at Harper, who took a seat beside him. "We're going to go over the events of that day again," Bennett said, leaning forward slightly. "I need you to be completely honest with us, Jake. This is your chance to explain your side of the story." Jake nodded, but his expression was tight. "I understand, Captain." Bennett glanced at Harper, who started the questioning. "Jake, walk us through what was going through your mind when you first saw Marcus Johnson in the park." Jake hesitated, his eyes shifting as he searched for the right words. "I saw a man who fit the description of the suspect we were looking for. It was a high-pressure situation, and I had to make a quick decision." "And what made you so sure he was the suspect?" Harper pressed. "He matched the description," Jake repeated, his voice more defensive now. "We were looking for a black male around his height and build. He was acting suspiciously, like he was trying to hide something." Bennett could hear the strain in Jake's voice, the way he was grasping at justifications. "Jake, the witness statements and the body cam footage tell a different story. They show that Marcus Johnson was cooperative and tried to explain who he was, but you didn't listen." Jake shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "He was trying to throw me off by buying time. I was just following my training, Captain." "Your training?" Bennett repeated, her tone sharp. "Jake, your training doesn't excuse racial profiling. It doesn't excuse the fact that you escalated a situation that didn't need to be escalated." Jake opened his mouth to respond, but Bennett held up a hand to stop him. "Look, Jake, I'm not here to argue with you. I'm here to find out the truth. The evidence we've gathered so far isn't in your favor. It shows that you made assumptions based on race, and those assumptions led to an unjust arrest." There was a long silence as Jake processed Bennett's words. Finally, he spoke, his voice low. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I was just trying to do my job." Bennett sighed. "I know, Jake, but intent doesn't change the impact of your actions. This isn't just about you. It's about what your actions represent and how they affect the people we're supposed to protect." Before Jake could respond, another knock came at the door. Harper stood and opened it, revealing Marcus Johnson, who stepped into the room with a calm, composed demeanor. Mr. Johnson, thank you for coming in, Bennett said, standing to shake Marcus's hand. Marcus nodded, his expression neutral. Of course, Captain. Bennett motioned for Marcus to take a seat, then turned back to Jake. Jake, we're going to hear from Mr. Johnson now. I want you to listen carefully. Jake nodded. Though he couldn't meet Marcus's eyes, Bennett gestured for Harper to begin. Mr. Johnson, can you describe your encounter with Officer Matthews from your perspective? Marcus's voice was steady. I was at the park enjoying my day off when Officer Matthews approached me. He was aggressive from the start, demanding to see my ID and questioning me as if I were already guilty of something. I tried to explain that I was an FBI agent and that there must have been some mistake, but he didn't listen. He cuffed me, pushed me to the ground, and treated me like a criminal. Jake flinched at Marcus's words, but he remained silent, his gaze fixed on the table in front of him. Harper continued. Did you feel that Officer Matthews' actions were influenced by your race? Marcus didn't hesitate. Absolutely. I could see it in his eyes, the way he looked at me, the assumptions he made before I even had a chance to speak. I've dealt with this kind of thing before, but it's different when it comes from someone who's supposed to protect and serve. Bennett could see the impact of Marcus's words on Jake, the way his shoulders slumped slightly, the way he seemed to shrink into himself. But still, Jake said nothing. Thank you, Mr. Johnson, Bennett said. I appreciate your honesty. Marcus nodded, then stood to leave. As he reached the door, he paused and turned back to Jake. I don't hold any personal grudges, Officer Matthews, but I hope you can take this as an opportunity to learn, understand the impact of your actions. It's not just about what you intended. It's about how those intentions play out in the real world. With that, Marcus left the room, leaving a heavy silence behind. Bennett looked at Jake, who was still staring at the table. Jake, this investigation isn't just about finding out what happened. It's about making sure it doesn't happen again. We have to do better for the people we serve and for ourselves. Jake nodded slowly, but there was no fight left in him. The weight of the evidence, the words of Marcus Johnson, and the reality of his actions were all starting to sink in. Whether he was ready to confront that truth remained to be seen. Take the rest of the day, Jake, Bennett said quietly. We'll reconvene tomorrow. Jake stood, his movements stiff, and left the office without another word. As the door closed behind him, Bennett felt a heavy sense of responsibility settle on her shoulders. This investigation was just the beginning. There was still much work to be done, both within the department and beyond. But for now, all she could do was continue to piece together the truth and hope it would lead to real change. Captain Laura Bennett sat in her office, the final report of the investigation lying closed on her desk. The conclusion was clear, and the decision had been made, but that didn't make the task ahead any easier. She glanced at the clock, knowing Marcus Johnson would be arriving soon. The conversation they were about to have felt like a turning point, not just for Jake Matthews, but for the entire department. A soft knock at the door signaled Marcus's arrival. Bennett stood and smoothed the front of her uniform, preparing herself for the conversation. Come in, she called. The door opened and Marcus entered, his expression calm and composed as usual. He gave Bennett a polite nod before taking a seat across from her. Thank you for coming, Mr. Johnson, Bennett began, sitting down as well. Of course, Marcus replied, his tone steady. I assume the investigation is complete? It is, Bennett confirmed, leaning forward slightly. After reviewing all the evidence, the witness statements, the body cam footage, and the interviews, it's been decided that Officer Matthews will be terminated from his position. Marcus nodded slowly, taking in the information. I appreciate the thoroughness of the investigation, Captain, but I have to ask, do you believe this decision will lead to real change within the department? Bennett paused, choosing her words carefully. I believe it's a step in the right direction. Jake Matthews' actions were unacceptable, and his termination sends a clear message that racial profiling and the abuse of power will not be tolerated. But I also know that firing one officer isn't enough to address the deeper issues at play. Marcus's gaze remained steady as he replied, You're right. This is about more than one officer. It's about the culture within the department, the training officers receive, and the biases that can influence their decisions in the field. If we don't address those underlying factors, incidents like this will keep happening. Bennett nodded, appreciating Marcus's candor. I agree. This incident has brought to light the need for systemic change, and I'm committed to making that happen. We're already working on revising our training programs to include more comprehensive education on racial bias and de-escalation techniques. We're also planning to implement more rigorous oversight and accountability measures. That's a good start, Marcus said, a hint of approval in his voice. But it's going to take more than just policy changes. It's about changing the mindset of the officers, helping them understand the impact their actions have on the communities they serve. That's not something that can be achieved overnight. I know, Bennett admitted. It's going to be a long and difficult process, but it's necessary if we want to rebuild trust and ensure that what happened to you doesn't happen to someone else. Marcus leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. I've been in law enforcement long enough to know that change doesn't come easy, especially when it involves confronting uncomfortable truths. But I'm willing to work with you, Captain, to help make those changes. This isn't just about me. It's about creating a safer, more just system for everyone. Bennett felt a surge of respect for Marcus. Despite everything he had been through, he was still willing to engage, to push for the reforms that were so desperately needed. I appreciate that, Mr. Johnson, Bennett said sincerely. Your experience and insight will be invaluable as we move forward, and I want you to know that your voice will be heard. Marcus nodded. Thank you, Captain. I'm not looking for any special treatment. I just want to ensure that this department becomes the best version of itself. That's what the community deserves, and that's what the officers deserve too. Bennett couldn't agree more. You're right, and I promise you, we're committed to making that happen. The room fell into a comfortable silence for a moment, both of them reflecting on the weight of the conversation. The decision to fire Jake Matthews was just the beginning. The real work lay ahead in the reforms and cultural shift necessary to prevent future injustices. As Marcus stood to leave, Bennett rose as well, extending her hand. Thank you again, Mr. Johnson. I look forward to working with you. Marcus shook her hand firmly. Likewise, Captain. Let's make sure this is a turning point, not just a momentary reaction. With that, Marcus left the office, leaving Bennett alone with her thoughts. She glanced at the closed investigation report on her desk one last time before turning her attention to the future. The decision had been made, but now it was up to her and the department to ensure it led to real, lasting change. She knew the road ahead would be difficult, filled with resistance and challenges, but Bennett was ready. This was about more than just one officer, more than just one incident. It was about doing what was right, no matter how hard that might be. With renewed determination, Bennett reached for her phone and began making the calls that would set the reforms in motion. The department needed to evolve, and she would do everything in her power to make sure it did. The morning was overcast as Marcus Johnson walked up the steps of the precinct. The air felt heavy, like the city itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Inside, the atmosphere was tense, but charged with anticipation. The changes Captain Bennett had promised were starting to take shape, but there was still a long road ahead. As Marcus entered the building, he noticed subtle shifts in the environment. A new bulletin board near the entrance displayed information about upcoming workshops on racial bias and de-escalation techniques. Officers moved through the halls with a different energy, conversations quieter, more serious. The events of the past few weeks had left an indelible mark on everyone. Marcus made his way to Captain Bennett's office, nodding politely to the officers he passed. Some returned the gesture with respect, while others avoided his gaze, still grappling with the fallout of what had happened. When he reached Bennett's office, he found the door slightly ajar. He knocked softly before pushing it open. "Come in," Bennett called, looking up from her desk. Marcus stepped inside, closing the door behind him. Bennett rose from her chair and offered him a warm smile. "Good to see you again, Mr. Johnson." "Likewise, Captain," Marcus replied, taking a seat across from her. "I wanted to see how things were progressing," Bennett said. "We're making headway," Bennett nodded, her expression serious but determined. "The new training programs are being rolled out, and we're implementing stricter oversight to ensure accountability. It's a start, but there's still a lot of work to be done." Marcus appreciated her honesty. "Change takes time, but it's encouraging to see the steps you're taking. How's the department handling it?" "There's been some pushback," Bennett admitted. "Not everyone is on board, but most officers understand that these changes are necessary. We've had a few difficult conversations, but I'm hopeful we're moving in the right direction." Marcus leaned forward slightly, his gaze intent. "That's good to hear. It's important to keep the momentum going, to ensure these changes are more than just a response to one incident. Agreed, Bennett said. This is about building a new foundation for how we operate, one that's rooted in fairness and respect for everyone we serve. As they spoke, the door to the office opened again, and Jake Matthews stepped inside. His face was drawn, his eyes shadowed with exhaustion. He was dressed in plain clothes, a cardboard box in his hands. It was clear he was there to collect the last of his belongings. "Captain," Jake greeted Bennett stiffly, avoiding eye contact with Marcus. "Bennett," she replied, her tone neutral. For a moment, the room was silent, the air thick with unresolved tension. Jake finally turned to Marcus, his expression tight. "Mr. Johnson, I just wanted to say I didn't mean for things to turn out like this." Marcus met his gaze calmly. "It's not about what you meant, Officer Matthews. It's about what you did and the impact it had. Intentions don't excuse actions." Jake flinched at the bluntness of Marcus's words but nodded, accepting the truth. "I know. I don't know how to fix this." "You can start by acknowledging the problem," Marcus said evenly. "We all have biases, but it's how we deal with them that matters. You have the opportunity to learn from this, to become a better person because of it." Jake's shoulders slumped slightly, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He turned back to Bennett, his voice barely above a whisper. "I suppose this is it then?" Bennett nodded, her expression softening. "It doesn't have to be the end, Jake. You can still choose to grow from this, to make changes in your life. But that's up to you." Jake stood there for a moment as if considering her words before giving a brief nod. "I'll think about it." He paused, then added, "Good luck, Captain. And to you as well, Mr. Johnson." With that, Jake turned and left the office, the door closing behind him with a soft click. Bennett and Marcus watched him go, both lost in their thoughts. "Do you think he'll be okay?" Marcus asked after a moment. Bennett sighed, leaning back in her chair. "I hope so. But it's out of our hands now. All we can do is focus on the work in front of us." Marcus nodded in agreement. "And there's plenty of that." They sat in silence for a few moments, the weight of their conversation hanging in the air. Finally, Marcus stood, extending his hand to Bennett. "Thank you for everything, Captain. I appreciate your commitment to making things right." Bennett shook his hand firmly. "Thank you, Mr. Johnson. Your involvement has been invaluable. We're in this together." With that, Marcus turned and left the office, making his way through the precinct one last time. As he walked down the halls, he could feel the eyes of the officers on him, some curious, some contemplative. He knew that change wouldn't come easily, but he also understood it was necessary. The events of the past few weeks had opened a door, and it was up to all of them to walk through it. As Marcus stepped out into the cool morning air, he took a deep breath, feeling a sense of resolve settle over him. The path ahead would be challenging, but he was ready to continue the fight for justice. This was just the beginning, and he was determined to see it through. What do you think about the way the police officer approaches the black man in the park? Do you believe situations like this happen more often? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you like this story, please consider subscribing to my channel. I pour my heart into crafting these heartwarming videos for you, and your support is what keeps me going. I appreciate having you on this journey.